It's really just such an honor to have you join us and to share with our community, Dr. Shelemay. I'm going to share a little bit, if it's okay, about you and introduce you to our community. Dr. K. Kaufman Shelemay is the G. Gordon Watts Professor of Music at Harvard University, and she's a former chair of the Department of Music. She is an ethnomusicologist specializing in musics of Africa, the Middle East, and urban United States. Dr. Shelemay is a giant in her field. And I'll share a little bit personally because my husband is on this Zoom with us. He's an ethnomusicologist. So not only is she a giant in her field, she is a household name that that I've known both through my husband because she's so well known for her work, and through my professor, Dr. Mark Kligman, who's at UCLA, because she continues to be his mentor. She is the author of numerous articles, reviews, and award-winning books. Her work has garnered her both the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award and the prize of the International Musicology Society. She was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, and Dr. Shelemay was a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, has been awarded a number of major postdoctoral fellowships, including grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the NEH, and the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Radcliffe Institute. She's a past president of the Society for Ethnomusicology, and she was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Academy of Jewish Research, and a fellow of the American Philosophical Society. She's also a Walter Channing Cabot Fellow at Harvard, and she held the chair for modern culture at the Library of Congress. Before joining the Harvard faculty, Dr. Shelemay taught at Columbia, where she received an award for distinguished teaching, at NYU, and at Wesleyan University. So, and this is, I had to cut this way down because this woman is an absolute force of nature, and we are just beyond lucky to have her join us here. So, Dr. Shelemay, thank you so much for joining us in as you are our kickoff of what we're calling Zimrah Talks, where we're going to talk about Jewish culture and folkways and music in different parts of the world. And of course, you're here because we're delving into Ethiopia this month. So I wonder if you could start by giving us an overview of some typical Ethiopian traditional instruments, what the cultural context is in which they're played, and also share with us if there's a difference between secular versus sacred when it comes to instrumentation in Ethiopian culture.
Well, first, let me say thank you, Cantor, for the invitation, and I'm glad to be here with all of you, and I'll be happy to answer your questions as best I can. Thank you for that generation, that extraordinary introduction, which was quite amazing. What is the usual saying? You're supposed to say, well, you know, my mother would have believed it, but thank you very, very much. And I just think I'm beyond lucky to be with you. So it's very nice. You asked me about instruments, and it's probably as good a place as any to start when you're dealing with an unfamiliar tradition, because instruments are cross-cultural, but they vary quite a bit from place to place. And I guess one of the most interesting things about Ethiopia is that it is one of the few countries in the world that maintains lyres, that is L-Y-R-E-S, please. They are, in many places, historical instruments. Ancient Egypt had lyres, but Ethiopia and Uganda and East Africa have maintained lyre traditions. So we can start with those. Those are all secular instruments. And I would say, to answer your other question up front, yes, there is a distinction between sacred and secular, and there are names for it. In the Ethiopian tradition, the national language, well, one of the national languages, if they're still a nation, I don't know if you've read the paper today or heard the news, but the situation there is ghastly. And all of us who are involved with Ethiopia are, in a word, horrified with what's going on. Nothing good is coming out of this, and we're very, very concerned. There are a lot of people, unfortunately, who are at risk of dying. So it's a pretty awful situation. But most of the people speak Amharic, which was the national language. There are now several. And Ethiopia historically was a Christian country with a very old church from the fourth century. And they have a liturgical language, kind of their own Latin, if you like. Ge'ez is what it's called. It's spelled Geez, pronounced Ge'ez. So you have linguistic distinctions between sacred and secular, and you have sacred and secular instruments. And the instruments that are played in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and those that were played by the Beta Israel or Ethiopian Jews, those are known as being part of the tradition, which is Zimrah, sacred music or chant. And the other category is Zephen, which is secular music. And all the instruments like the lyres go into the secular category. Although there are moments when they cross over. For example, in processions of the church, there is a one-string bowed lute. It's kind of like a cello, but with one string, and it's bowed. It's actually remarkable. And it heads up a lot of processions, and it is played by the Ethiopian Jews at their festivals and feasts as well. So that are religious, but afterwards have a secular component. Do you want to play a recording of one of the lyres? Would that be a good place to start?
I think that's a great idea because it's wonderful to hear your explanation, but I think it helps us really understand what they are. So Don Levy, I want to thank Don Levy, who's our behind the scenes person here from Wilshire Boulevard Temple. Don, would you play us that first clip that we have there?
Let me tell them what it is. This is an older recording of the Karar, K-R-A-R, a 6-string Ethiopian secular lyre. It actually is known as the devil's instrument because it was so associated with drinking houses and places of ill repute, shall we say. But you will hear a very famous musician, Asnakech Worku, who's playing the instrument, and she's actually singing a song about Jerusalem, which is not at all surprising because Ethiopian Christians made annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem. The Ethiopian Jews have ended up moving there, but it's a site that is beloved, and there are sites in Ethiopia, such as the rock churches of Lalibela, that replicate Jerusalem in Ethiopia. Okay, we can play the first one, Asnakech Worku with Karar singing Ende Jerusalem. She's singing about my mother, Jerusalem, and personifying the city as her parents. So it's a common image in Ethiopia. Now, in more recent days, there have been a lot of electrified karars, and I understand that's what Kibron Berhane, who sometimes performs for your Sabbath evening services, actually plays one. And I understand he may play it this week as your kind of entry and exit music, right?
Yeah, he will. It's beautiful, and really looking forward to his joining us.
Yeah, so you could, if you want to play the other example, you can, of the more recent electrified one with an ensemble, or you can make them wait for Friday night.
we can play. Let's play about 30 seconds of that, and then what I'm going to do is I will put just as I did For the other one, I'll put the link in the chat so that if anyone wants to watch the entire clip later, you can.
This is Fendika, is the ensemble that's playing, and I believe there's dance and music with and song too. Masenko, the one-string bowed lute, but the karar, and especially the large lyre, is called the David's lyre, and that's the begena. Do you want to go ahead and pull that one out?
Sure.
One too, then we will have shot our wad on all of our examples from the top. Let me just say a word about the begena, which is the 10-string large lyre. It is actually a sacred instrument in the Ethiopian Christian tradition, and it was very much an instrument played by nobility. I mean, this was a court. Historically in Ethiopia, the church was run by an emperor, and it was a very structured society in terms of different classes of privilege and descent. And so the begena was an instrument that was played by nobles, both noble men and noble women. And it was done for reflection and for meditation. And only in recent years has it been played as part of kind of instrumental ensembles. So what you're going to hear is Alamu Age, who is one of the most famous begena players in modern Ethiopia. And he's a real virtuoso, and it has a buzzing sound. And there's a lot of significance to the instrument. There's iconography, there are paintings of this instrument played by different Ethiopian emperors from past centuries, and they're all dressed as King David, and it usually says King David and the lyre. So it's very interesting. Okay, let's hear the one by Alama Aga.
Tausamañi hagari, rasamañi hagari, tausamañi hagari, rasamañi hagari, tausamañi hagari, sikafai ነው መኖሬ, rasamañi hagari, የገዳይ አጋዳይ rasamañi hagari, ሆነ ከመመለስ rasamañi hagari, እልም ጥርግ በል እስከ ወዲያው ድረስ rasamañi hagari, እልም ጥርግ በል እስከ ወዲያው ድረስ rasamañi hagari, ለፍጥረቱ ሁሉ rasamañi hagari, ባያል ቸረቸረ rasamañi hagari, እኔስ በሀገሬ ብኖር ምን ቸገረ rasamañi hagari, እኔስ በሀገሬ ብኖር ምን ቸገረ rasamañi hagari, መካሪ የበዛ rasamañi hagari, ቤት ስራ የሚለው rasamañi hagari, ምን ያታክተኛል አሁን ላፈርስ rasamañi hagari, ምን ያታክተኛል አሁን ላፈርስ rasamañi hagari.
As he was playing, it made me want to be physically present, because you feel like you want to feel the vibration of the instrument.
And this is an instrument that is associated with healing. and literally healing. In fact, I mean, there are whole historical traditions associated with this instrument and healing with the Virgin Mary in Christian tradition. But beyond that, the church musicians are associated with healing. They make amulets. They're kind of like big mezuzot, but they're written with magical incantations, and they do healing formulas. And so there's a lot of association between music and healing, and that sound of the begana is part of it.
That's wonderful to hear. We could all use a little healing in our lives.
Yeah, we could.
Right now. Thank you. So are the instruments that you shared with us, we saw that one of the video clips that you shared was recent. What's the usage of traditional instruments in Ethiopian culture today?
It actually is quite prominent. And you know that there was a very bad revolution in Ethiopia between 1974 and 1991. It was a Marxist military group overthrew the country. But they shut down popular music. There was great jazz in Ethiopia. They shut that down. They shut down church music, for example, and liturgical music. But the one thing they supported was traditional music. Mm-hmm. And every town, every neighborhood in the town, and the different provinces at that point were 12, there were hundreds of performing groups. And so a lot of young people became traditional musicians because it was a pathway for support and survival during the revolution. And it also saved young people who did music from being part of the troops who were sent out to the countryside to, quote, educate the peasantry. So a lot of the musicians now who live in the American diaspora, the sort of musicians you might hear in LA's Little Ethiopia, many of them were part of these groups called Kinit during the revolution, and that's who they're trained. But this is actually served as a lifeline for traditional music in amazing ways. It did not, though, benefit popular music and sacred music. So here we have different stories of survival. So you could hear it now on radio, on TV. I don't know, now in the middle of the pandemic, it's hard to remember a time when we went to clubs and we went to hear music, or we heard them at restaurants. But all of these places, one would hear secular music and traditional music.
Seth just put in our chat box that he associates the music with Ethiopian restaurants. Seth, were they playing live when you saw them, or is it played on recording?
Mostly in recording, although I did go to one where they played live with, I think it was that larger lyre that you had just told us about.
Was that
Ethiopia?
No, I've been to them in Europe, but mostly here in Los Angeles.
Mostly
I even went to one in Iceland, which was very cool.
Where?
In Iceland, there's an Ethiopian restaurant in Iceland. When you go on the Golden Triangle, it's in a tourist area of Iceland. There's an Ethiopian family that has a restaurant that's been there for a long time.
Anywhere you have an Ethiopian, you will have an Ethiopian restaurant, and anywhere that there are musicians, you usually play at the restaurant. What I was told when I was doing field work, I've been working on the Ethiopian diaspora musicians for many years now as well. I was told in LA they have trouble getting performance permits, and so the various restaurants that I talked to owners and people at in LA, in Little Ethiopia, they said many of them did not have live music. But in Washington, D.C. and in the Washington metropolitan area, there was a massive presence of Ethiopian musicians at restaurants, at clubs. It was quite extraordinary. It's changed during the pandemic. But that was really the center of the Ethiopian musical earth for many, many years.
That is actually where that was where I saw Ethiopian music playing live in a restaurant, was in the Washington, D.C. area.
Do you remember which restaurant by any chance?
I don't. It's possible. I know there's a neighborhood where there was a bunch of them right there, and it was right in that area.
Interesting. Yeah. There have been a series of neighborhoods. What year was it, if I can ask? Do you remember?
You know, I go there very frequently for work, but I'm going to estimate it was maybe about 15 years ago, something.
Okay, probably U Street at that point. You may have gone to Dukum.
I think.
And they have a big group and dancers. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Interesting. Yeah. And they play recordings, a lot of which are now made in the US.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Did I answer that one?
I think so. I think so. So in 86, you wrote a book, an award-winning book called Music, Ritual, and Falasha History. So I'm wondering if you can share with us, and I know that you're still very, very involved, and you have another book coming out with a broader subject. Can you tell us what sort of changes the community has faced since the time that you wrote your initial book?
Well, that book was published in 1986, and I actually was in the villages of the community. They were called Falasha by themselves and by everyone when I did the work. The name change came in the very late 80s and immediately after the revolution, and it was heavily driven by people from outside Ethiopia, which is interesting. And the name Falasha does have, I said a rigid class system from the old imperial order, and you really did have, they were a minority, a religious minority, and they were an occupational caste, if you like. They did metalwork, they did pottery, etc. So it was not a high status identity, although it was not anything pejorative. It was nothing like some of the worst words that are used to describe other minority communities. But the new name, calling them Ethiopian Jews, also reflected their status in modern Israel. And that was the massive change that took place. I did my work. I was the last researcher in, one of the few there during the revolution because they threw everyone out. But I had married my husband, who was a member of the permanent Sephardic community there. And so I got to stay, lucky me, for the revolution. And it was a very shattering time. Millions of people went into exile, and many Ethiopian Jews left their villages in the north and took an overland route to the Sudan. So their lives had changed totally. There are officially no more Ethiopian Jews in Ethiopia. The entire community, by and large, went to Israel, where they have resettled and have been recognized. And there are isolated numbers of people here and there, very few in the United States. I've just finished a book on the Ethiopian American diaspora, and I talk a little bit in the beginning about why I don't talk about Ethiopian Jews in that book, because they're but there are a few Ethiopian Jewish musicians, especially in Israel, and there have been a number of musicians who are not Ethiopians who have performed and otherwise been active with Ethiopian music. So this is a community that over the past half century has been in total flux. They have changed countries, they have changed names, they have changed languages, and they are really remarkably resilient. And there has already been the first Beta Israel, or their traditional name was House of Israel, Beta Israel. Although they didn't usually call themselves that, they would say, I am Israel, but they didn't call it so much. They called themselves Falasha. But the first member of the community who went to Israel with her family when she was around 10 was the first Israeli ambassador to Ethiopia. And so we have seen this community grow and become part of the Ethiopian Israeli community.
Thank you. Thanks. That's really helpful and interesting to hear also about your field work. I have the viewpoint of being married to an ethnomusicologist, so I know how important field work is to the work you do. But I'm wondering if you can just share with our community why it is that it's important to actually be with the community as you learn about their culture and folkways.
Well, there's really no other way to learn about what people think about what they do, how they talk about how they do, and actually what they do when they do it. And in terms of the Ethiopian Jews, I got a couple of recordings random people had made during visits, but I really wanted to study the liturgy. I wanted to figure out what they did in their prayer house. And so I needed to tape entire rituals that took place primarily during the evening, all night. They would start about usually 10 in the evening. Sometimes there was an earlier service, and then they would go all night, sometimes all the next day. So these were really very long recording and taping experiences. I actually lived in the villages for days at a time, and I kept a room in the provincial capital in Gondar. And I would go back and forth, and you will know, believe it or not, a different me many decades ago rode a horse out to the village. And I would usually have someone with me because you wouldn't have a woman alone in the countryside. But as a foreign woman, I was sort of a marginal male. And so I've actually written a book about this experience. It's called A Song of Longing, an Ethiopian Journey, and it's published by University of Illinois Press. And believe it or not, it is 30 years old. You can still get it. And it's a book for real people, and it's about my field work. It's about my marriage in Addis Ababa and being part of the foreign community and the foreign Jewish community there, and then also about the revolution, which also transformed our lives because we were nationalized, and it was pretty traumatic. Wow. So yeah, so I had a really an old-fashioned, now extraordinarily basic field experience, and the community was wonderful to me. They really had me in their villages. They treated me so kindly. And it was an amazing experience. And their liturgy and their musical tradition proved to be something unsuspected, but fascinating. And so it was all in all a wonderful experience.
Thank you. It's interesting as you're sharing, I'm thinking about the Beta Israel community in all being in Israel now. And God, they have, I know the community faces its own serious challenges there, but I'm glad that they are safe at this point, and just pray for safety for the rest of those who are in Ethiopia at this time. Mm-hmm. So you talked about your fieldwork and recordings, and today actually is an Ethiopian Jewish holiday, the holiday of Sigid. And I was wondering if you could share your knowledge about this holiday and your experience around it.
Yeah, I was actually in the villages that first fall during Sigid. And I was very interested because it's an unusual holiday. It's held not just in one place, but it does involve pilgrimage from local areas to local hills or mountains, where a ceremony is held in a kind of enclave of rocks in the top of the mountain. And so I was in the village of Ambober, and we processed out, and there were 7 clergy. By the way, they were not rabbis, they were kahanat, they were priests. And they sang as they proceeded up. They did a ritual on top and one coming down. And I actually got out earlier an article I wrote, gosh, when was this? 1980, 81, if you can imagine, in my youth, about the significance of Sigid, a Falasha pilgrimage festival. And I can just read you a little bit about it. The name Sigid is derived from a Giz root meaning to bow or to prostrate oneself. Although the occasion is called Mahela also, a Falasha priest said that the liturgy they chanted on the mountain is termed Mahela. There is a similar observance in Ethiopian Christian practice, and this is a tradition that is associated with monks and nuns that were part of the Falasha religious practice. This is little known. It was in all the footnotes, but it's something that remained very, very active until the mid-20th century. But it is a day of entreaty, and it is held several times a year, but the big holiday is about now in November, or in the month of Hadar, as it's known, Ethiopian month of Hadar. And it's linked with several things. Some of the people I interviewed, the priests, said that it was a reminder of the prophet Ezra's injunction against intermarriage during the Babylonian exile of the people in Israel. And let me quote one of them. This is a quote from Kes Burhan, Priest Burhan, who actually immigrated to Israel and died there some years ago. And he said, Sigurd is a reminder of the announcements of Ezra. He told the people to keep their religion and customs in order that they would be returned to their country. They had to separate themselves from the Babylonians and were not to make union with them. So I always have found these comments very interesting. And there are other associations by Kesadana, who actually is the father of the young man who was the first Ethiopian Jewish rabbi, Joseph Odana. Let me read this one. He traced Sigurd to the ceremony performed by Ezra and described in the book of Nehemiah, and to the reading of the law. And this is what he said. While they were in Babylon, Ezra gathered the people at the mountain and announced the laws of God in words to the people. The important thing for the people is to read the 10 Commandments. As the people were leaving the country of the idol worshippers, they were told by Ezra the rules of their father and the laws they must remember until they return to Jerusalem. These are the laws that come from the Orit, from the Old Testament. Don't forget them until you get the chance to enter Jerusalem. So there are a lot of traditions separate about this holiday, and many of them have to do with the giving of the 10 Commandments, not in association with Moses, though, in association with Ezra, but the 10 Commandments are read aloud, and sections of the Decalogue is read. The 10 Commandments are read aloud, and that's unusual because in most of the Ethiopian Jewish liturgy, everything is sung. There's not a cyclical reading of the Torah. And so it was unusual that they read the Decalogue. There was only in one other holiday that I heard read segments, and it was also the 10 Commandments.
Oh, that's fascinating. So there is some overlap in terms of the meaning of this holiday with Shavuot then.
Yeah, somewhat. I guess. I mean, they don't link it.
Right.
And they really, it now has shifted very much in Israel to be an occasion of community solidarity. And so you will hear different histories in Israel, and things change. People move, people create and recreate, and they change things. So it's not a surprise, but this is what I encountered in Ethiopia and what was in 1973, the practice and the traditions about it. And you will have very different ones now. And I think the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews, are just one of the more resilient and creative of Ethiopian communities who have, over the years, had to reinvent themselves to survive.
It's fascinating, and I'm so glad that we're able to welcome Kibrom to our community so close to this holiday to highlight something that is different, unusual for our community, and a learning experience. I do want to point out, because you mentioned that there are I can't remember if you said very few or no Beta Israel musicians in the US.
I haven't run into them, and I've really traveled and done a lot of work. I occasionally will meet a member of the community. I once gave a talk in Washington, and someone came up afterwards and had even read my book, which was very interesting. But there aren't many.
Yeah. So I want to point out to everybody here that Kibrom is not part of the Beta Israel community. He is Ethiopian. and his background is evangelical. So
Christian, yeah.
Evangelical Christian, thank you. And he'll be bringing the sounds, as Dr. Shelemay shared, these the rhythms and melodies within communities really do overlap. So he will be bringing that, and we have another instrumentalist who will be playing guitar, who's very familiar with Ethiopian styles, who's Israeli. So we're going to bring these cultures together, and then Ava Nahas, who many of you already know, will be playing percussion for us on Friday. So I hope all of you are able to join us and experience really an overlay of our culture and Ethiopian musical folkways. I want to be very clear that what we're presenting on Friday in no way is what you would hear in a Beta Israel community. It's not what we're trying to present, because it wouldn't be, as I was sharing with Dr. Shelemay earlier, it wouldn't be a prayerful experience for us if everything was completely unfamiliar to us. But we'll just add a little flavor to our Shabbat experience. I do want to ask you to share what you're working on now with our community, and then also, as Dr. Shelemay is sharing, if any of you have questions for her, why don't you put them in the chat box, and that way, if any of them are overlapping, I can kind of bring them together. But I will recognize who you are as I share the questions. So please go ahead, write questions if you have them. And Dr. Shelemay, please let us know what's happening now.
Well, what's happening now is I have a book coming out in January from the University of Chicago Press, and I actually gave you, I think, a link to it. If he could maybe put it up, you can see the cover. It's rather nice. An Ethiopian musician is on the cover. It's about music and migration. It's about the forced migration of musicians out of Ethiopia since the revolution and after, but it has a big historical segment, and it really talks about it. So the title is Sing and Sing On: Sentinel Musicians in the Making of the Ethiopian American Diaspora. The musician pictured is Ali Bira, who's one of the most famous Oromo musicians in Ethiopia and the world. He left actually a little bit before the revolution because he had to. He lived in Sweden. He ended up settling in Canada, and he is now repatriated back to Ethiopia. So there has been a flow back, and this extends to Ethiopian Jews who've gone back for visits and a few for even business purposes. So there has been an interesting return since the revolution was over. But sentinel musicians, this is a phrase I've coined, are musicians who guard and guide their communities. And throughout Ethiopian history, into the period of the revolution and the very difficult days of being diaspora communities abroad since then, the musicians have played an important role in their communities. And this book is about them, and it's dedicated to them. And the title of the book comes from a poem of an Ethiopian poet laureate, from right at the end of one of his plays, about sing on. And I'm very much, it's my hope for them. I did research for this book all over the United States, and I've done work with some expatriate Ethiopians in Europe and elsewhere. They're all over the world now. A little work in Israel, but not so much. And that field got so full that I just decided I would stand by my work in Ethiopia and then do some other things. Also, Ethiopia reopened to research in the 90s. And by 2000, I wanted to go back and do more. So I also have been doing research with returnees there. And so I've looked at the cycle, but this is the book. It'll be out in January. And it has been, it's a long book, almost 500 pages long. But I'm very, very glad that it will be coming out at a point at which the musicians with whom I work, I hope it will at least commemorate and acknowledge the wonderful things they've done for their communities, and to help each other. and to help others that they know. So that's the latest. And I'm always writing and doing things. Yeah.
I put the link in the chat. As you can see, if anyone's interested, you can pre-order Dr. Shelemay's book.
Don't order the cloth copy. That's for libraries.
Okay.
And there is a PDF if anybody likes. And there are some reviews at the bottom of the PDF. And one of them is particularly an eye-opener, which you might enjoy seeing if you know anything about popular musicians today. I got quite as a book blurb from a very famous musician, which made me very happy.
How exciting.
Yeah, so you take a look, you'll see it was really a thrill. And he is mentioned in the book. He is Canadian Ethiopian, but it still has been very exciting, this whole process. So that's what's going on.
That's wonderful. I love that phrase, Sentinel Musicians. It's so beautiful. I think sometimes there's this idea of, I hear sometimes, well, you just do music. And how very important music is to culture, and to storytelling, to identity, and to helping us live better lives. So,
and healing, and it's a window. Music is a window on just about everything we do. And I see your husband nodding his head. And as an ethnomusicologist, we are so privileged to study these materials and to be able to enter into people's lives. And I think, it's wonderful when we can pay them back with a publication that acknowledges what they do and the good works that they do.
Thank you. I'm going to use that phrase and acknowledge you.
Thanks.
So we have some wonderful questions from our people here. The first comes from Seth, actually two from Seth, and I think that you can address them actually both together, which is, can you talk about the usage of Gez, the language that you shared with us in the Jewish community in particular? He asks if it is used there, how it's used, and also about the priests. Are there still priests active in the Ethiopian Jewish community? And if so, what is their role?
Okay, Gez is the liturgical language of Ethiopia. It's a language that came out of the earliest days of the church, and the Beta Israel Ethiopian Jewish liturgy is entirely in Gez. There's no Hebrew in the liturgy. In fact, there is also an older, even Ethiopian indigenous language, Agau. The Beta Israel were part of the Agau community, which is an old indigenous community. And so all of their prayers are in Agau and Gez, with small sections here and there in Agau. So that's the story of the Gez, and they had not so many manuscripts, and it's primarily an oral tradition. Oral tradition is very important across Ethiopia, and even in the church, which has a notational system, a system of church notation, actually, which I've written about it well in a 3-volume thing. It's fascinating, but they transmit their tradition as an oral tradition. In any event, the priest, yes, I mean, the names of the clergy, their title is Kahanat, Kahen. They're called Kes, and this is the term for an officiant in the Ethiopian Christian tradition, and you have the same clergy in the historical Beta Israel tradition. Now, a number of young Ethiopians in Israel who speak Hebrew and who have been trained in modern Judaism have become rabbis. They also have a few traditional priests. These people are getting old. If you think about the number who are already very, very elderly when I was a young woman working in Ethiopia, and now this generation is almost gone. And so there are some practicing Beta Israel priests in Israel, especially of those who were from the Tigray region, which has been in the news lately because of the horrible fighting. There was also an Ethiopian Jewish community in Tigray, and they spoke Tigrinya, not Amharic, but they also had the liturgy in Gez. So it's a very interesting tradition. Seth, did that answer that for you?
Yes, thank you.
Sure.
Yes, very thoroughly.
Okay.
So Mara asks us about like a traditional Shabbat service in Ethiopia and how that would compare to what we're used to. So first of all, we know already it's going to be in a language,
Yeah.
a different language. But in terms of the liturgical benchmarks themselves, would there be things that seem similar, or is it completely a different animal?
It's a different animal. You do have a text blessing God. And the Sabbath, the ritual in the evening, you have an early evening service that lasts half an hour, 40 minutes. It's called the Wazema, is the name of that service. And then in the morning, you have Sabbath Aneg, which is praise of God. And it starts before dawn and goes to about 7:30 or 8. And then there is an event called the Sabbath of Sabbaths, where you have a 24-hour ritual every 7 weeks, and which is interesting. But you will not hear Adon Olam unless you hear kids singing it because they learned it from visitors from Israel or from their own teachers who worked in Israel. Occasionally, one of the Beta Israel teachers will perform a Hebrew ritual. And they'll just be time out from the traditional ritual. There'll be a brief Hebrew ritual. They will chant, and usually Ashkenazic liturgy, not Sephardic, which is kind of interesting. And then they'll go back to the traditional liturgy. But no, there are not the same prayers. I mean, in my first book, I actually do have an appendix of the prayers, which I transcribed with the Giz text, trying to let people see the repertory that one deals with. I did once write an article comparing the prayer Yitbarak Ziabher Amlak Israel, blessed be the God, Lord of Israel, looking at it and seeing what I could find in terms of similarities to the Kaddish. But it doesn't really touch on, is not the same text, and it doesn't really parallel it directly. So, and there are some prayers that draw on Psalms. There's some prayers that draw on apocryphal materials, like the three youths in the fire. And there are some hymns that are shared with the church.
Amazing.
So it's this tradition is so much more interesting for what it is than for what we would have it be. Yeah. And I have really valued, having the privilege to learn about this liturgy, because I could not have imagined this when I was preparing to go into the field, that this is what I would find. But it is a remarkable tradition. I hope as more people are continuing to work in Ethiopian studies, we will find out even more about it. But at least I was able to do the groundwork and get testimony from the elderly priest who remembered and who themselves had studied with the monks and knew a lot of the oral traditions. But there are remarkable things in that liturgy, like the name of a 15th century Ethiopian emperor. And other things. So it's a remarkable tradition, and the Beta Israel should receive great credit for having maintained it all these centuries.
Absolutely.
What else do we have?
Scott has a very long question for you. So I'm going to ask Scott, will you unmute yourself and share your question?
Sure, and please excuse the sirens and helicopters in the background. This campus is noisy.
I've just been thankful there were no garbage trucks during my talk. Seriously, you never know what you're going to get now.
The curse of academia. Yeah. I'm really curious. Many of us in synagogue life would have had experience with touching into areas of this by going to the Old City, and especially going to the Ethiopian church.
Yes.
Walking through, not necessarily hearing much in the way of music. And I'm really curious if there's crossover between the Ethiopian church and this population that's now in Jerusalem, because it seems like it's two, almost like Ashkenazic and Sephardic, like it's two generations that are just so far
it's
apart.
A little more different and separated than that. The liturgies are separate. They do have a great deal in common, but they are really separate traditions of separate communities. There is surely some interaction between Ethiopian Jews and Ethiopian Christians in Israel. I haven't been working actively in Israel in a long time. I do talk to colleagues who work there. And a lot of times, people, because it's much better to be an Ethiopian Jew than an Ethiopian Christian in Israel because of recognition and being part of the community, one doesn't always know with whom one is dealing. But there, yes, are a lot of Ethiopian Christians in Jerusalem. Historically, there have always been making pilgrimage. There are there's the monastery, there's the wonderful church on Rehov Hechalutz, Rehov, Ethiopia. I'm trying to remember the name, not Rehov Hechalutz, Rehov, Ethiopian. I expect the Ethiopians will always have a presence there. The emperor, the last emperor, Haile Selassie, had property in Jerusalem, was very tied to Jerusalem as well. And the whole tradition of the Ethiopian emperor as the Lion of Judah. I mean, the whole connection of Ethiopia to Jewish lore, to the story of Solomon and Sheba, it goes on and on and on. And at this point in their history, the Ethiopian Jews keep this history at arm's length. They want to be embraced as members of the Jewish community and not accentuate their Ethiopian roots. And so for those reasons, I think there is relatively less contact, although a lot of Ethiopian musicians come to perform in Israel. I know Mulatu Astatke, the jazz musician, who's a very good friend, goes frequently. Astera Wicca, the singer, everybody has been, and there now are Ethiopian musicians who have become big singers. There is a singer who represented Israel, an Ethiopian Jewish singer who represented Israel in the European, what's it called?
Eurovision.
Yeah. So, and there have been a lot of people who've been borrowing from working with Ethiopian music as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
We're coming close to the end of our time, so I actually think we have a great question to close with. Bonnie Kebri asks us, what was Shabbat like in your experience? And so we've touched on what it would be like to be in synagogue, but I think let's close out with what would it be like if we were invited over to someone's home to experience Shabbat in the home?
It would be different in a home in Tel Aviv or in Beersheba, in a modern apartment. What it was like in the villages was magical. And actually, my first night in the villages was Erev Rosh Hashanah. And if memory serves, it was a Shabbat that year. And I remember I had my tape recorder, but I knew they didn't light lights on the Sabbath, and I was very worried, but I wanted me to bring it in and to turn it on and to record. But it was just very moving. I mean, the village experiences is what I remember the most strikingly. And there was the short evening service, and then you would break and have some sort of repast. It was basically roasted corn, and other small things. And then in the very early morning hours, we would go to the prayer house and there would be the morning service. And so it was a day of rest, and the Beta Israel were always very careful about maintaining that holiday and a feeling of sanctity for the day.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Dr. Shelemay is off to teach today, and I want to thank you again so much for sharing of yourself and your experience with our community. It's been just an absolute joy to host you. We are honored that you spent time with us. We hope you'll come back again sometime.
Thank you. And I hope to see you again. And it's very nice to meet another ethnomusicologist here and all of you from the community. Thank you so much for coming.
Have a wonderful day, everybody.
The same, everyone. Take care.